Good evening, everyone. I'm Joey Schergenbach, and here we go again with the 2022 to 2023 winter weather forecast. Hope everyone had a great Thanksgiving. And before we know it, it's that time of year where we start talking about winter and what is in store for us. So before we talk about the oceans, which is the big indicator that we look at to start, we also look at what happened during the fall. So recapping this fall, it was one of the warmest falls on record in Boston. Closing out November were like 3 or 4 degrees above average. October was very warm. September was seasonally warm, but generally it was warmer than average. It has been a colder second half of November, but the overall mean is still well above the normal. Generally, when you have a warmer than average fall, you're going to have a warmer than average winter. Not necessarily a less snowy winter, but typically the warmest falls on record in Boston locally do transcribe over to a milder winter with not as much snowfall. However, the correlation is not that direct, and there can be exceptions. And then another big indicator that we look at is the Pacific Ocean. So generally, with ENSO patterns, you have either an El Nino or a La Nina. El Nino is the warming of the waters off the Pacific Ocean. La Nina is the cooling of the waters off the Pacific Ocean. This year, for the third straight year, we have another La Nina, as seen here in the Pacific Ocean, the cooling of the waters off the Pacific Ocean. So another La Nina winter for the third straight year. However, over the past few weeks, there has been a signal that the La Nina is starting to weaken. If you look at these anomalies in the sea surface temperatures, a few weeks ago they were a lot stronger and it was a lot colder in the Pacific. It does seem to be leveling off a little bit. However, that does not mean that we are transitioning over to an El Nino. It just means that the La Nina signal is weakening a little bit. However, it is still going to be a La Nina winter. And patterns are going to vary depending on the strength of it, depending on the positioning. But with it being a weaker El Nino and the center of its focus more central to easterly, that does bode better for a colder and a trough to form in the eastern U.S. rather than a westerly based La Nina, which generally translates to a colder west but a warmer east. And then looking up north in the North Pacific and as well as Alaska, that is another big indicator. Typically, in order to get cold down to the lower 48 in the eastern United States, you would want it to be warmer up in Alaska. And to start with getting warm up in Alaska, you would want warm sea surface temperatures around Alaska. And as seen here, we have a pretty warm pool here just south of Alaska, but then it gets a little bit colder right just south of Alaska. So would that favor a warmer Alaska or a colder Alaska? But then you also look at the Aleutians, the string of islands in southwest Alaska, and that does seem to be pretty warm. So that would indicate a ridge developing in the Aleutians, which could transcribe over to a ridge pushing into Alaska. And then another big factor, the annual polar vortex. So, as explained in the past few years, the polar vortex is another big indicator. So after talking about the sea surface temperatures in the Pacific, we now go up into the Arctic and talk about the polar vortex. And what that is just a big, strong current of air way up in the atmosphere, up in the Arctic. And as this model shows, with a strong polar vortex, you get the cold air stuck up north in the Arctic, and it just circulates there as long as it has to. And generally, the lower 48 is milder with warmth flowing in from the south. Meanwhile, a weak polar vortex is the complete opposite. You have colder air moving south and then warmer air moving up north. Typically, when warmth gets into the Arctic, cold air will fall south. So these two are, of course, direct opposites. And this year, early on, the polar vortex is actually taking a lot of beatings. It is off to a very weak start. It has been stretching a lot. There are hints of a perhaps further disruption or split. However, predicting the polar vortex out in advance is so difficult to do. So the general notion is just to focus on where it is right now. And right now, it is on the weaker side, but that does not necessarily mean it is going to split or get disrupted further. Another oscillation that we look at, kind of separate from the typical Arctic oscillation, is a QBO, which is Quennial Biennial Oscillation. And this oscillation, generally, it's in the stratosphere and it represents the wind. And the wind is going in a certain direction. And so it either goes easterly or westerly. Going back into the history of winters, generally when there is an easterly QBO, it's a colder winter with more high latitude blocking, which is ridging and warmth up in Greenland and the Arctic. A westerly QBO is the complete opposite, a milder winter with a lack of high latitude blocking and colder in the Arctic in general. However, this year the QBO does not seem to have a very strong impact, so it has been in the easterly phase and now it's starting to skew a little more towards the westerly phase. However, it doesn't mean too much right now. It does not seem to have too strong of an influence. Now, looking at this evolution, this is a model projection that obviously can be modified and is not 100% accurate, but it's looking at the evolution of the pattern going forward. So, as explained a few minutes ago, you looked at the sea surface temperatures and how the ridge in the Aleutians would correlate into Alaska. However, oddly enough, Generally, a ridge in the Aleutians and a ridge in Alaska are two very different things when it comes to the impact on the weather down in the lower 48. When the ridge is focused more towards the Aleutians, which is seen here as the center is more in the Aleutians, less so in central Alaska, that does send cold down into the lower 48. However, it does also screen for the cold to go into the central U.S., or the Midwest, so Wisconsin, Minnesota, to get deep cold. But sometimes that cold can have a really hard time pushing east into Boston, into our area on the East Coast. Meanwhile, if the ridge in Alaska moves northeastward into the center of Alaska and into Hudson Bay and Greenland, that can force more cold down directly into the lower 48, and we could get the brunt of it. And then looking at this evolution, you do see the pattern. The ridge tries to push into Alaska, but it seems to generally stay focused in the Aleutians. Now, that does not necessarily mean that warmth will develop on the East Coast, but another factor we look at is what is going on in Greenland. As explained a few minutes ago, whenever you have a big ridge or warmth developing in Greenland, that indicates high latitude blocking, which can basically, as the term said, block warmth from the south from getting up north into the eastern U.S. and northern tier, and it allows cold to plunge down. And with the cold coming in from the Alaska, pushing the cold down into the lower 48, the high latitude blocking can help sink that cold down and prevent the ridge in the southeast from getting in the way. And then we talk about oscillations. So the ridge here in Alaska, or in the Aleutians, is the East Pacific Oscillation. And generally speaking, a negative East Pacific Oscillation screams for cold trying to come down, and a positive East Pacific Oscillation would be if there's a trough in Alaska, which is the complete opposite. And a ridge is what is defined as an area of high atmospheric pressure. So all of these reds and yellow colors here, that is indicating a ridge. Meanwhile, a trough is the complete opposite. It is an area of low atmospheric pressure. And often, what happens in Alaska and in the Arctic, the opposite is happening in the eastern United States. So, with some warmth developing here in Alaska as we head into the first and second week of December, that would scream for colder air to move down into the eastern United States. However, the storm patterns and where these line up are also going to play a significant role. We talked about two oscillations, the East Pacific Oscillation and the North Atlantic Oscillation, which is the NAO, what is happening here in Greenland. Negative NAO, just like the EPO, means a ridge in Greenland and a block. A positive NAO means a trough in Greenland and colder air. But another oscillation that we look at is the PNA, which is the Pacific North American Oscillation. That is down representing the western United States. And it's also important to not focus on the colors and focus more on the isobars here, which are these skinny lines here. And the isobars, when they rise up, that is indicating a ridge. When they dip down, that is indicating a trough. And looking at these isobars here, with a trough, at least somewhat, developing in the western United States, but no real ridge, clearly, that is indicating a neutral to more negative Pacific North American oscillation. And that does seem to buck some of the trends for colder air to move down to the eastern United States, because what a negative PNA can do is help develop cold in the west, which can help fight off cold trying to come into the east. But then another factor, and this is no oscillation, but what is going on in the southeast? And in La Nina winters, they generally have a habit of creating a southeast ridge here down in Florida and in Georgia. And that southeast ridge loves to flex northward into the northern tier. And the big factor that blocks that is, as the term says, high latitude blocking. So can high latitude blocking develop in Greenland to prevent that ridge from flexing north? Meanwhile, if the blocking lets up and if the polar vortex stays strong, that would allow the ridge to come north. However, with a negative PNA looking here, that will make amplification for storms a bit more difficult. So what might end up happening is a lot of tracks might come right through Massachusetts or west even, rather than it being a big coastal storm. At the same time, though, typically with a big block, storms don't usually go inside. They cannot get there, so they generally take a more coastal track. But what a negative PNA also can do is, as I said, provide amplification and supply more cold air, which would favor more of a winter storm rather than a wet or mixed bag storm. So now we go into the month-by-month breakdown of what to expect this coming winter. So, it starts with December, of course, starting in just a few days, a month that I think will be cold. And as mentioned earlier, with warmth developing in Alaska and in the Arctic, I do think that cold will push into the eastern United States at some point. How strong does it get? How quickly does it push? And how much does it push? remains to be seen. But I do think December will generally feature a colder pattern, especially in the first and second week. It might get off to a mild start, but I think by the second week, it will start to turn a lot colder. I also am expecting an active pattern in December. Despite there not being a lot of amplification in the west, I do think we will see some undulations around with a lot of warmth developing in the Arctic and some high latitude blocking, which can help fire up some bigger coastal storms. So therefore, I do think December will offer the best chance for bigger coastal storms to develop and perhaps give us a more significant snowfall. However, in January, I do not expect that pattern to last very long. So therefore, I am expecting a milder January, but active. I do think that busy pattern will stay. But with it being a milder pattern, I am expecting the high latitude blocking to sort of break down a little bit. And oddly enough, in winters where there are more disturbances towards the polar vortex and disruptions early on, the polar vortex often has a habit of re-strengthening as the winter goes on. Not always, and that does not mean we will not get a further disruption or split. But if it does follow the general notion, when there's a strong polar vortex, that means that there's a lot of cold in the Arctic, especially around Greenland, which is the complete opposite of high latitude blocking. So therefore, if that happens, the blocking will break down and eventually go away. So there will be nothing to prevent the storms from cutting inland. And when there is a strong polar vortex, you don't usually see these big undulations around. So that would take a lot of coastal storm threat away from New England. So therefore, I do think we will see more inside running events and more cutters. That does not mean, though, with an active pattern, there will be plenty of chances for snow, but I do think inland will be favored more in January. And in February, always an adventure in February. Some years it's 70 degrees and then it snows the next day. But when it comes to the average mean temperature, February is almost always warmer than average. The past several winters, it has been warmer than average, perhaps significantly. And I am expecting that to be the case this year. I am also expecting it to be a drier than average month, so generally just a warmer and drier month. However, there's always a question, especially in La Nina winters, which have been known to have some interesting occurrences in the stratosphere with the polar vortex. And what often seems to be forgotten is if there is a disruption or split to the polar vortex on our side of the hemisphere, if that happens in December or January, the effects often take at least a few weeks to kick in, sometimes even a month, and sometimes even a little bit more. So if that's the case, if it happens in December or January, the effects may not kick in until February. And if a disruption occurs, that can sometimes trump and get in the way of the southeast ridge trying to flex. And as mentioned in January, while I think the blocking will let up and allow the ridge to flex itself, if there is a disruption, that blocking might come back and prevent the ridge from flexing, and it would lead to a colder and perhaps stormier month. However, that's always a big question, and in La Nina winters, generally in February, the southeast ridge really tries to flex. So there's always that question, will the stratosphere get in the way? But for now, I'm going to go with a milder and drier February. Now March, the final month of winter, generally, and sometimes it's March. Sometimes it's in like a lion, out like a lamb. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes it's in and in. Sometimes it's out and out. But for March, I am expecting a wintry start. Sort of like a last gasp for winter a little bit. If you remember 2018 to 2019, we did have a little last gasp of winter in early March. I am expecting something similar to that, perhaps not as big of a storm in early March, but some chances for snow, perhaps one more coastal storm in early March, especially the first half. However, I do not expect it to last. I think it will be a milder and warmer second half of March. I am expecting somewhat of an on-time spring start this year for New England. Obviously, it's all relative, but I think the best chance for snow in March will come at the beginning and then perhaps turning significantly warmer in the second half. Now, that leads to the official snowfall total prediction in Boston, going to go with 30 to 35 inches of total snowfall covering the whole winter at Logan Airport. Now, of course, this is very localized, and believe it or not, last winter, a very rare occurrence in which Boston and the coast actually recorded more snow than the interior, such as Worcester. That almost never happens, but last winter, pretty much all of the storms were coastal, and they some tracked offshore, which meant the coast got snow, but inland really got spared with a lot of dry air stroking out. However, I am not expecting a repeat this year. I think this year will feature a lot more snow for inland because I think we will see some coastal storms, but I think we will also see a lot of storms that come through us and go west or inside, and that will favor inland over the coast. So more expected away from the coast, 30 to 35 inches in Boston. The average snowfall in Boston is about 42 or 43 inches, so I am going with a slightly below average winter, but not too below average, and warmer than normal, but not crazy warm. Generally, just a slightly above average winter when it comes to warmth, and slightly below average when it comes to snowfall. So that is my best guess for this winter. How about yours? I would be happy to chat with you more in the comments. We will see if this happens. This could be a huge bust. This could verify very well. Remains to be seen. But thank you all so much for watching. I really do appreciate it, and I will see you all in the next one.